United Healthcare, Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, Raise Your Voice 2020 Advocate Connection Program, December 2nd, 2020, Parking and Scooters.
Again, my name is Chase Bearden. I'm the Deputy Director at CTD, and my audio description is I'm a white male. I use a manual wheelchair, wearing a plaid shirt, sitting in our guest bedroom. For me, CTD has been working on issues, and I know we talk about this every time, our history going back to 1978, across the board. We worked from voting to what seems like in my lifetime parking all the time, which is what we're here to talk about today, but also appropriations and everything in between. And our goal with these Raise Your Voice events is really to get that focus, bring up the things that happened last session, kind of have a good discussion about that, and see where we're heading into this next legislative session. So our goal with CTD is just to have y'all's voice heard. It has been since the beginning. It's to take our members' issues and bring them forth to the legislature. So just kind of to set the experience for any of you that haven't attended, and this is mainly to hear y'all's thoughts. We're gonna do about 20 minutes where we've invited a guest speaker to talk about parking with us, and to really make sure that we're hearing the issues that you're dealing with, where it connects with electronic mobile scooters or accessible parking. I want to introduce Mack Marsh. I've known Mack for a long time. He has kind of been one of those people that's helped me figure out parking issues for so many people, and has probably one of the most in-depth knowledge about parking in Texas and how that affects people. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce Mack, let him introduce himself and what he does with parking mobility. And then we'll kind of do some question and answer back and forth between he and I, and then break out into some breakout sessions. Mack, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Chase. I appreciate it. Quick description of myself. I'm a white male, use a power wheelchair from a spinal cord injury. I was injured about 20 years ago, and one of the very first things that I experienced was accessible parking abuse. Of course, way back then, they called it handicap parking abuse or handicap parking violations. I was surprised when I first joined this world that it was a problem. To me, being like anybody else who didn't have a disability, didn't have experience with disabilities, I thought everybody knew what the rules were and everybody followed the rules. And the reality is people don't follow the rules mainly because they don't know what the rules are. So we've spent the last 10 years in particular specifically addressing accessible parking through the Parking Mobility Program. For those of you here in Central Texas, if you're in the Austin area, we have a relationship with our local law enforcement where you can use the Parking Mobility app to report violators. Those reports get reviewed by law enforcement, and then a citation is issued to the owner of the vehicle. That person has to take a class. It's kind of like safe driving for a speeding ticket. I know Bryson doesn't have any recollection of the speeding ticket, but it's kind of like a speeding ticket. You take a class, you learn what the rules are, and hopefully you don't repeat offend. And what we found is people don't once they learn what the rules are. If you don't live in Central Texas, the app is still available to you. And in fact, we really encourage you to use the app, because what that does is it gathers really valuable data. That data is used by us to help get your community on board with that education program, with that enforcement and education program. But it is also really valuable data to help educate the lawmakers. So there's lots of talk about accessible parking at the legislature every session. And so having data as to what's going on all across the state really helps us to educate lawmakers on what's going on and come up with changes in the law that make sense. A lot of times we want change in the law, but that's not rooted in data. It's not rooted in anything other than what we think might happen. And that data really helps us make sure that we get good rules, not just rules. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that today. So that's kind of where we are at this stage with parking mobility. We're we're enforcing and educating right here in Central Texas. In other parts of Texas, we're gathering data. The more people that are reporting, the more people that are using the app, the faster we can grow through other parts of the state and really start to get a handle on reducing the violations that are out there.
Yeah. And Mack, that kind of reminds me, and I've told this to legislators before. In your intro, you talked about, when you got injured, you didn't realize there was an issue, there wasn't enough parking. And for me, when I got injured, I was 17, and 2 weeks before that, I was with my girlfriend, and I had parked in an accessible parking space because she wanted to go to JCPenney. And she goes, well, why are you parking here? And I'm like, these are always open. 2 weeks later, I broke my neck. So I kind of say that karma really got me on that one. I learned a very valuable lesson after that, but I didn't realize how important at that young age it was for other people. And I think that's something that's not taught.
It's equally important, not just for other people who don't have disabilities, but it's equally important for us to educate the disability community ourselves. We found that 43% of the violators in our program are people who identify as having a disability. And so they just didn't know what the rules were. They parked where they blocked the access aisles, or they forgot to put up their placard, or they didn't put their placard up appropriately. And those are things that may seem really minor to someone who doesn't understand this issue. But what it is it adds to that global problem of accessible parking abuse. And so we have to educate ourselves as much. One of the things you said, and I think in the poll it mentions having a problem with not enough accessible parking. As someone who uses it on a daily basis, I drive a van with a ramp, and so I have to have an accessible parking space. My knee-jerk reaction years ago when we started this was that there's not enough parking. What we've actually found is that there's plenty of accessible parking. It's just that it's not being used appropriately. And so we really need to get smart as a community within ourselves and using it appropriately and educating ourselves and others on how to use it appropriately.
Yeah. And that kind of brings up and leads us into, the next section of this and talking about the last legislative session. For years, there's been bills filed on accessible parking. And I think early on, you're right, a lot of it was emotional based. And, there is no data out in there in the world on accessible parking and who's using it. One of the biggest issues that we found was the basic one that, if you needed an accessible parking space, you went to the doctor, they filled out a prescription. You walked into your county tax assessor office, you handed them that, and you walked out with 2 placards. There was no education on it. And I know early on, even for myself, I drive a truck with a crane that comes around. I didn't realize how important it was not to hang over a little bit on the striped area. It just didn't dawn on me right away that affected other people. And, last session, there was a bill filed. It had some pros and cons. It still does. And it was Representative Springer's bill, I believe HB 3163. And there's still, one of the things that why we wanted to support it was that was the first time there was a bill that was going to get through that actually discussed giving people something up front when they went to get their license plate or their placard that had those rules. Do you want to kind of talk about those rules and what they were and how that works?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that really surprised me way back when we started this as well. And it still surprises me today. When you go and get a placard or a plate for your vehicle, if you have a disability, you're not told what the rules are. And nobody in that system knows what the rules are. Most physicians don't understand the nuances of accessible parking. I can assure you, no one in the county tax assessor's office knows anything about accessible parking, and they're the ones that hand out the placards. And so it's really important that we do a better job of proactively educating people. And I was really excited about that bill. It was a great bill. It's the first attempt to educate proactively. It also, I think, supports the idea of educating reactively, like we do with parking mobility, where someone gets a ticket and then has an option of taking a class. We hope to do more around that in this next session. I think we'll talk about that, the hopes for a new bill this next session. But it also had some weaknesses in that bill. And one of the big things was in an attempt to make parking more apparent and the nuances around that parking more apparent, it changed how spaces are marked, which is a good idea. It's a great step, but it was not well thought through. And we didn't use a lot of data to understand what that meant. And so what we ended up doing was making a lot of accessible parking in the state unenforceable. I'm going to show if I can share my screen. I don't know if this will work or not. No, it's not allowing me to share my screen for some reason.
I was trying to set that up so you can. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. So what we found was that there are over 1 million accessible parking spaces in Texas, and that's an estimate. We measured almost 30,000 parking spots that are going to be out of compliance or that are currently out of compliance with those new rules. In other words, they're not marked properly. The new rules state that the sign has to have some indication as to what the potential fines are. The accessible parking area adjacent to the parking spaces must have the words "no parking" in it, and some other marking issues. Those are great ideas, but we didn't implement that law appropriately. And so what happens is that case gets filed if either a volunteer or a law enforcement officer writes a citation. It goes to court. It gets reviewed by an attorney, and that attorney, the prosecuting attorney, has to make a determination as to whether or not it's a legal case. And right now, if a space does not have all of the markings that are necessary according to the law, then that space is not enforceable. And so there are over 1 million of those spaces now in Texas. We need to go back and fix that part of that bill so that it can make those spaces enforceable on some minimum standards. And there's some ways that we can do that. But we just have to, as advocates, get better at articulating not only what it is that we desire as an outcome for these laws, but also using the data that's available to us, using the tools that are available to us to be able to advise ourselves as well as those lawmakers and those decision makers on those rules based in data evidence, not just in what we think is going to work or what we hope will work or what we're passionate about working. It's got to be grounded in concrete or we could really do some damage. Because what happens is if those spaces, those 1 million spaces are unenforceable, then essentially we've become a state that doesn't have any enforcement around accessible parking at all. Because law enforcement's not going to take the time to go and make sure that every space is marked properly if their citations are just getting thrown out of court. That's not their job.
And really, that's what we've found is the most effective way to ensure parking is enforcement that leads to some kind of education. We don't even, the fine is one thing. Sometimes after someone is gone through, had a ticket written multiple times, that's kind of the only way it's going to sink in. But the real education piece, getting that class, being able to, divert yourself from paying a fine and taking that hour, 2-hour class that explains what accessible parking is for, really makes a bigger change we've found than anything else. And
we have a violator here in the Austin area, and I'm not allowed to show you a picture of his vehicle because it actually would identify who he is. But we have a violator here in the Austin area that in the last 5 years has received 57 citations for parking in accessible parking spaces. He's paid his fine, the full fine, every single time. He's not shirking the law. He's thumbing his nose at the law, but it hasn't changed his behavior. What we've seen though, is that when someone takes one of the classes, it's a 2-hour class, they learn what the rules are, but more importantly than learning what the rules are, they learn why those rules are there. They learn about people with disabilities. They learn about how what they do affects others in the community. and it changes their behavior. We have almost zero recidivism in that population. And in the 9 years we've been doing this program and educating people who receive a citation, we've had 6 people who have repeat offended over thousands and thousands of people who have gone through the class. So that's a 0% recidivism rate. Does it completely change behavior? No. Is it going to completely solve the problem? No, not until we get widespread enough. But I think this is the right step. Having some proactive education would be a right step as well. We hear all the time in our class, we do a survey at the end of the class to ask what people learned. And one of the things we ask is there anything else you'd like to say about this course? And invariably they say, thank you so much. This is the first time anyone's ever told me what the rules are. And this needs to be shared more widely. And we agree. We think everyone who takes a driver's ed course in the state of Texas needs to know what accessible parking is and why those spaces are important. We think everyone who receives a plate or a placard that allows you to park in those spaces should be not only given the rules, but should acknowledge that they were given the rules so that they understand, hey, there's some consequences here if I don't follow these rules.
And I think, that leads perfectly into where we're heading in this next session. Last session, we had filed a bill with Senator Zaffarani, SB 870, if I remember correctly. And it would have increased across the state, basically the same abilities we have right here in Central Texas, where with working with parking mobility in the county, if a volunteer gets the citation written through the app, the person's then able to take the course. Not all counties or jurisdictions are willing, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mack, to allow to have that kind of deferred course unless it's written into law. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, there's some resistance from some judges. Judges, much like people in the disability community, all have different opinions about things. And one of the things that they have a difference of opinion about is what they can and can't do. Some judges are extremely liberal and they take their powers to be absolute. And so they think they can do anything they want to. Others say, well, if it is not spelled out specifically in law, then I can't do it. And so what we'd like to have is some what we call enabling legislation, some legislation that says, Judge, you can, if you want to, educate this person in lieu of just a fine. When judges are given that option, they would much rather educate. When we talk to judges, they all say this is a great idea. Some say we can do it, others say we can't. But they all love the idea because it gives them an option. Right now, in law, the only penalty for an accessible parking violation is that $500 minimum fine. That's the only option a judge has. So that really gives them one other option, and that's to dismiss the case. There's an 80% dismissal rate in this state. We're not addressing this problem. We're not solving this problem by doing anything if we're not enforcing the law, number one. But number two, enforcement alone doesn't solve the problem. Like I mentioned before, people get citations, they pay the fine, and they continue to do it because they never learned what the rules are. If we give judges an option, then I think they're more likely to give that educational option, take that class, and now we get to make that fine go away. Most people will do that, and most judges would do it if the law enabled them to do it.
And so that kind of also leads into, we in technology world, they call it disruptive technology. And I think that's what the world of scooters, for those of you that may live in a city that doesn't have them yet, be thankful. But we have little electric scooters all over Austin and other cities too, that you may find a couple hundred on one street, and they're found at the corners near the ramps. There was at the beginning really a big fight to make sure they couldn't park those on the curb cuts. They still do. Even in Travis County and Austin area, at the beginning, what you would do if one was parked blocking the sidewalk, say you found that accessible parking space, but now you can't get down the sidewalk or up a ramp because there's 3 of them parked on there waiting for someone to come up, use their phone to tag it, and then take off riding on it. The actual policy for Austin at the time was that you called 311, and then 311 had 24 hours to contact the company to have someone come out and move it. Well, that does absolutely nothing for anyone besides it keeps it sitting there. And the idea behind it was they figured someone, a rider, would come within 24 hours and use it, and it would end up getting moved. It's kind of one of those first, it was really kind of a reverse in civil rights because we had no ability to fight back on this. And as we talked about accessible parking and being able to write a ticket for someone who parks a vehicle in that spot, right now we're still stuck in the situation where if you pull up and there's 6 of those scooters parked in the access aisle of the accessible parking spot or right in the middle of the accessible parking spot, and I actually have a picture of one with about 20 of them that have been left there by the company, there is no recourse. There is no way to get them fined or, in education. We've worked with the companies, we've talked to them. They say basically that they've given education, but it's found deep inside the fine print. So as we move forward, that's something we have to also look at and include into any legislation we're working on, is how do we make sure that any disruptive type technology or transportation coming forward doesn't also take away the ability for someone to have access. And I don't know, Mack, I know y'all have gotten tons of reports about it. If y'all have anything to say about it, or if there's anything you could do.
We do. So in the parking mobility app, you can report different violation types. And one of the violation types that we've built into the app is what we call a non-vehicle report. Most people use it to report these parking spaces that are out of compliance with the current rules, but you can also use it to report scooters or anything else that's blocking a sidewalk or blocking any other architectural improvement. Unfortunately, there's not an enforcement mechanism there yet because these scooters aren't licensed. They're not registered with the state. There's no way to determine who was riding it, who left it there, other than the company that owns that scooter knows who it was, because you have to register through the app to use their scooter. We did, along with Chase, have some conversation with the scooter companies, these micro transportation companies, a couple of years ago. I think where the answer to this lies, both in education, legislation, I think is going to be important to have some real rules with some real teeth behind it that are uniform across the state. But none of that's going to happen if we, the disability community, those of us who are affected by the problem, don't take ownership in the solution. The reason that the education piece around accessibility is buried within the fine print of the scooter companies is because the scooter companies don't have people with disabilities in their face. They're not working for them. They're not their primary customers. They're not the people that they're paying attention to. How do we get them to pay attention to us? Data. When people report those scooters that are parked illegally, we can gather real world data. We can show the scooter companies, here's the problem. Here's where it's occurring. Here's when it's occurring. Here's how it's occurring. And we can say, these are the thousands or even millions of people who are affected by this problem. And we're able to have a larger voice then when we can take that data and tie it to the stories. Unfortunately, not every person, not every Texan with a disability can come down to the Capitol during session and tell their story. It's going to be even harder this session, I think, to be able to come down and tell your story. I think there'll be some opportunities via Zoom or however else electronically. But what we can do is those voices that are able to speak can be given more weight when we have data that backs them up, that says, okay, here's one story, but here's thousands of people who have similar stories and similar instances that happen. And so that way we can really start to magnify our voices and who we are by using that data. So the parking mobility app has a part of that. If that's not something that the disability community wants to get behind, I think there needs to be some way that we gather data around this issue to look at solutions. If we don't have data, we're not going to be able to solve it, because the scooter companies have data, and their data shows that people love scooters and that they use them a lot, and the scooter companies make a lot of money off of them, and it supports the local economies. And so that's their data. Our data needs to say, okay, there are people who are affected negatively by this. We don't want to do away with the scooters necessarily, because they can be good for our community, but we have to have rules that make sense for everyone.
And you know, as we move forward, these are some of the things that I know me and Mack have worked on for a long time, and that we're going to continue to work on for this legislative session. And I know coming up next week, we're going to try to put together, as we're getting now a better picture of how the session is going to run. There is a work group that was put together by the new Speaker of the House to actually address how the session is going to start and how it's going to continue running through the 6 months that it's going. And that includes, how do we keep legislators safe, their staff safe, and those who are wanting to participate safe. I know they're looking at a lot of different ideas on how to do that. We may actually have some ability to electronically Zoom in, hopefully, but we're still, that's kind of day to day on what's happening and how that's going to work out. But it's going to take having all of y'all's voices and anyone you know that's run into these issues. And so we're going to break out into little groups right now, because we really do want to hear what y'all have run into, any other accessible parking issues or issues with scooters or sidewalks, something that really creates that barrier for people having access. That way we can make sure it's added in, because the one thing I keep hearing from legislators is, when are we going to be done with accessible parking bills? So it's kind of we need to, if we're going to move this forward, we need to try and fix as much of it as we can, so that we don't have to come back again the next session.
Following small group discussions.
This is Chase. Since we only have 5 minutes left and we've just come back from our breakout room, seems like we caught y'all on the tail end of similar things we were talking about. Is if y'all could go into the chat function and throw in some of those ideas of what you talked about right now while we wrap up. But I will say, you know, we had that same discussion about working more closely, especially like in the city of Boston, where they just passed Proposition A and B, where there's funding available, working with those in the bicycle world and in the safe lanes. And Brittany talked about, you know, making sure that as we redo the infrastructure, we have designated, you know, sidewalk infrastructure that allows for that room for scooters to be parked, and that way they're out of the way and not in the main flow of traffic. So I think there's a lot that, even just from our discussion, our group, that we can work on with where we're heading in the future. But for us, you know, I think we can take a lot of this and add it into what we're working on. And I'll, from there, let y'all, I don't have the chat function up right now. But yeah, collaboration, I think that's what's going to get us there. And that's what Brittany's talking about. And so we'll keep going through these, and y'all keep adding to them. Dennis, I'm going to kick it over to you, because I forgot a list of our sponsors, and I know you can rattle them off the top of your head.
Oh man, that's so amazing, Chase. I'll tell you what, let me see here, and I will pull that up. But I can tell you that we've done these, I think this is our 12th Raise Your Voice session. And all of these are free to anyone who participates, and a lot have. And the reason it's free is it really isn't free. It does have a cost. But that cost is being picked up by our sponsors. And from the lowest to the highest, started Surterra, Texas. Shield Healthcare, Molina Healthcare, MCNA Dental, CareSource, Bristol Myers Squibb, and DentaQuest partnership. The next higher level is AstraZeneca and Amgen. And the next highest level is Superior Health Plan, CDS in Texas, and Pharma. And our top level sponsors have made this happen all year long have been Amerigroup and United Healthcare. And we really appreciate their allowing us to bring this, well, this is community organizing, and we've been able to do it statewide with their support. We thank them very much.